on my computer. Awesome. So I would love to hear more. Okay. I'm going to introduce myself and I'm going to introduce you. So my name's Eleanor Hayworth. I'm an emerging evaluator working with Nicole. I'm with Ron Eglash, and we are really excited to have him here. So let's just dive right into it. And Nicole is also here. So hi, Nicole. So let's just dive right into it. I would love to know what you are currently working on and how it has grown from your work in Indigenous knowledge and microeconomies and getting out of extracting work.
The most recent thing I've been working on, we got a grant from OpenAI, which is the folks who created ChatGPT, and they were giving out grants for what they call democratic inputs. So they're worried that AI is going to be aiding and abetting, neo-Nazi racist groups or something, but they don't want to have a feeling of censorship, and so they gave out research grants for folks to look at that question. I've just brought in a new graduate student to our doctoral program from Uganda, Michael Nebari. And Michael wanted to do something on African arts. And so I thought, this is a great opportunity to bring in the kinds of non-extractive generative economy concepts together with that indigenous knowledge. But of course, African arts isn't just ancient indigenous examples. It's also, contemporary artists and architects and designers and everything else. So we've created a platform we call Ubuntu AI. And on that platform, African artists can upload their work and some text about their work. And so one of the things the platform does is just provide a way for folks to better publicize their work. If they're, crafting baskets or something, folks can click on a picture of the basket and that'll go to the website where they're selling these baskets. So it provides some value back to them in terms of exposure, right? But then we're gathering all of that data and we're offering that data up for sale to AI companies. So normally what an AI company does is they just go out on the web and they go, oh, look, here's a social forum. Let's grab all of that text as data, right? Or they go onto Wikipedia or, wherever they can get text and images from, they'll just take it from the web. And so the value that folks are putting into trying to share this stuff is not being delivered back to them. So this is a platform in which that will happen. If an AI company wants to use this platform to generate machine learning data, they have to pay. And then the payment goes back to the African artists and designers. So it's a way of taking the invisible extraction that's been going on in the machine learning world and then turning that into something that's actually of benefit to those artists, be they, basket makers out in a rural village or, contemporary artists in downtown Lagos or whatever it is.
That sounds like great work. I would love to hear more about closing the loop between just, the artists and the artisans and us, like how we can better support these groups, maybe outside of AI, but also even working within schools. So just learning more about how to close the gap in our local communities as well.
Yeah, so if you go to our site, Culturally Situated Design Tools, CSDT, and the full thing is csdt.org. If you go to our site, you'll see AI is one of the training modules that we have. And we actually use examples related to that initiative. So the first thing that students will see is just some little video clips about the kinds of harms that AI may bring to bear, right? And often when I read through the literature about, how do you do culturally situated mathematics or computing or whatever, it'll focus on the harms. It'll say, oh, well, this will help motivate the kids. You show them all the terrible things that's happening in the world and how you can use math to analyze it. And I think, for a certain percentage of the demographic, that's true. They're really motivated by that. And for some of them, it hadn't occurred to them that that was something you could do professionally, is do that kind of math-based social justice analysis. So that's of benefit too. But it's important to start as a teacher just to know your kids. And so often the first thing I'll do is just a little survey. We just throw up a Google Doc on the screen, and I'll say, everybody put down your name and something you want to do as a career path, the kinds of things you'd be interested in learning more about, however you want to think about it. And indeed, a few of the kids will have social justice related things, but most of them will not. They'll say, I'm really interested in entrepreneurship and business, or I'm interested in sports. And I want to do what my older brother does. He's in HVAC, heating and cooling, right? And I don't want to give off a vibe that those are unimportant or uninteresting or irrelevant, right, to STEM. So once you have that kind of information, then you can indeed, as I was saying with AI, you can do, help them out in critique. Here's how much those folks are being paid. Here's how many billions of dollars the companies that are hiring those folks are getting, right? A sense of injustice. But I think it's absolutely imperative that you have a positive side as well, right? So once we go through that little training on here's the potential harms that AI can bring to these different fields, and we have a little video clip of somebody interviewing folks in automated vehicles about how truck drivers are going to be in the cab with the AI, but that's maybe the first few years of it. Once it's perfected, the companies are going to say, well, why should I pay this guy just to sit there and do nothing, right? And babysit the AI. Once it gets perfected, clearly truck drivers are going to lose those jobs. And a lot of these professions, it's hard to see how we're going to maintain a kind of human AI collaboration at the scale that we're thinking. I think for the most part, people are going to have to leave those jobs and go somewhere else. So the next part of that little learning module, we show folks how AI works, right? So how does machine learning data take place? And the example we use comes out of an actual project we did. This is called Joe's Lunch. And in the scenario, everybody in school loves Chef Joe because of his home-cooked, delicious, nutritious meals, but he's in danger of getting fired because of the factory-made fake meals that are now being produced. And so your job as an AI developer is to create an app that can tell the difference, that can look at two meals and tell which one is the real, nutritious, homemade meal and which is the factory fake. And so we just give the student a bunch of images and they can select which ones to use to train the AI. But it blends the idea of learning STEM with learning to use it in a positive way, right? So it's not just the critique of all the dangers of AI or how people are getting ripped off. It's also thinking about, well, wait a minute, what if I wanted to develop AI that helped out folks like Chef Joe, right? And then we go from there because you want to start out didactic. You want to start out, telling the student, but you want to expand their agency. So the next step up is we ask the student to come up with some examples of the differences between reals and fakes where AI could be used. And it was quite interesting doing that with kids and having them say, oh yeah, my friend got hit with this scam. And so I think these online scams are fakes that we should have AI address. And we just have a bunch of these examples, and some from the kids' lives, some from things like in Africa, there's a huge problem with fake medication. And so you buy these malaria pills, but they're just sugar pills. They're not really malaria pills, right? This all comes from a project we did in Ghana, where we were working with kente weavers. and we noticed that tourists were purchasing fake kente cloth. So it was machine made. It looks pretty similar to kente, but it's being smuggled into the country. It's not legal to pass off fake, factory made cloth as kente, but nobody's there to police it really. And so we were in the market watching these tourists get duped into buying fake kente cloth, which is now undercutting the income that would have gone to the weavers. So I threw this problem at Kwame Robinson, one of our graduate students here at School of Information. And I just asked them, Kwame, can you develop AI that can tell the difference between fake kente cloth and real kente cloth? And this was 2018, 2019. So back in the Stone Age of AI, right? It goes through a revolution every 6 months, it seems. But Kwame was able to do that. So that was one of our first publications. And it got me thinking about the utility of this real fake distinction for the grassroots economy, right? So the first thing Kwame did was just a little literature background. And we found all these examples where folks were using it on something like, the Museum of Modern Art needs to see if it got a fake Van Gogh. And so I was telling Kwame, this is so typical that the first thing these computer scientists want to do is use this to help support millionaires and billionaires. I remember back when I was in graduate school, we had this new laboratory for computational mathematics, and they were crunching these nonlinear dynamics modeling systems that were really, very intractable, and you needed super high-speed computing to do it. And the grad students in the lab were so excited. I was asking them what's going on. They said, oh, well, we just found out about this application. They're going to use it in the World Cup. So that's where millionaires have yachts and they compete to see who has the fastest yacht. And so if you want to spend $10 million computationally modeling the curve of your hull to eliminate, another 3% of turbulence, you can now do so. So I was telling him, really, that's all you guys can come up with? That's the sector that gets the first benefits from this technology. But of course, they thought I was, a crazy hippie from across campus. I was a graduate student in the history of consciousness at the time. I'd gotten my master's in systems engineering, but then I switched over to get the PhD because I, just got tired of this kind of thing, right? But I was still trying to keep up my chops on the computational side. And fortunately, one of the mathematics professors let me join the lab. But it was, an eye-opener about how limited that the technological imaginary, right? The space of imagination for the folks going into these things, how limited that is. So I definitely think we need ways in the classroom of developing that at a very early age, right? And not just telling the students, here's what to use it for, but engaging them in their own interests, right? Okay, reals and fakes is such a large category. The kids are really good at just coming up with examples of that. So that's one part of it. And then the next part of that AI module finally goes to African arts. And we talk about using generative AI. So in generative AI, like NST, neural style transforms, what you can do is you can show AI a picture of a bunch of paintings, like here's a bunch of paintings of Van Gogh. Now I want you to create this African sculpture as if it had been painted by Van Gogh, right? So I don't mind Van Gogh getting ripped off because that's the millionaire's world, right? But the African sculpture, I think it's very problematic that AI is just going around the internet, scooping up images of African sculpture and using it without payment. So that's what this platform would give a real world example of. In the training scenario with the kids, we just say, now this has been a deal we've reached with the African art providers, so they're getting compensated, and now just play around with it, right? So here's a little. We use something like Scratch. It's blocks-based scripting, right? So really easy for kids to just snap these little things together like puzzle pieces. So we've developed that interface for AI. So you can now say, I want to do a neural style transform between this image and this image, and create your little Scratch-like script that does that. And now they've got Rihanna as if the image of Rihanna had been painted by, you know, some famous painter.
Wow. Yeah, that I think we're gonna have to wrap up in a little bit, but sorry, I'm just trying to wrap my head around everything you just said, but um what principles guide your work?
That's a great question. So I used to always say bottom up was my answer to that. Um, we were doing a project out on the Navajo Nation a while back, and I was watching the women uh, take wool from the sheep that they raise, and then they use plant dyes to dye the wool, right? Um, and I read this little piece that a biologist had done about the plant varieties that are around the sheep corrals. And it turns out that because when the sheep are grazing, they're getting all kinds of different plants. They come back to the corral and they poop. And so they're pooping out seeds because that's how seeds propagate, right? And so you have this biodiversity explosion around the corral. Um, but when the women are weaving, it's not bottom up, entangled, holistic. It's all about imposing order, right? So you've got to take that wool and literally untangle it. You've got to turn it into yarn, and you've got to spin that yarn. I mean, spin the wool into yarn, and you know, turn it into this Cartesian like framework, right? So I started to realize it's not just the sort of bottom up explosion of variety. It's also a top down ordering, and it's really in the alternations between that. So on the nature side, you've got this biodiversity explosion, but those get turned into the plant dyes and the wool, and then that value goes back to the sheep. Um, Here in Michigan, the indigenous groups practice controlled burns, and it's much the same. So when you do the controlled burn, you're creating just a very flat kind of order. Everything's turned to charcoal, right? But then once the rains come, you get this biodiversity explosion out of that. So in information theory, when we're talking about things that are diverse and entangled, we say that's high entropy. And when we're talking about things that are very ordered, we call that low entropy, right? So we've been calling this framework entropic modulation. And I've been working with indigenous scholars and some contemporary scholars on trying to put together a framework that thinks about how to use that as a fundamental principle. To think about, on the one hand, we want things from the bottom up that are very diverse, but on the other hand, we want to couple that with a phase in which things are more orderly. So I think that's sort of the key set of principles that I now see happening in these exercises, right? On the one hand, you want to encourage student agency. On the other hand, at the end of the day, these students need to pass a test, and you need to show that bottom up agency is actually turning into improvements of some sort. And maybe what you're doing is saying, well, I want to broaden my way of measuring the improvements, right? So it used to be that I was very regimented in how students showed evidence for learning. Now I want to say, well, you've got this computational tool, and I want you to show me what a log spiral versus a linear spiral looks like. And the kid cranks that out, right? Maybe they're not as good representing that in an equation as they are representing that in a computational script. But to say that, you know, counts as knowledge and the other doesn't is a little ridiculous. We're just imposing those boundaries on the fact that we insist on having the math class versus the computing class. And it always amazes me when I'm working with computing students and I ask them for some mathematical function, and they say, well, there's nothing in the language that I'm using, Java or whatever, that has that function in it. And I'm like, well, yeah, you've got to create that function. They say, well, yeah, but that's a math problem. I'm a computer science student. I don't do math. And certainly some of them, that's not true. That it's, they're math geniuses just like they're computing geniuses. But very often they're not. They went into computing because they could do so much more with programming than they could with mathematical equations. And so not giving our younger students that opportunity to express themselves in, they're all scientific modes, right? But there's such different modes of science to be inhabiting. So I think that fundamental principle of having both the sort of bottom-up agency diversity side and then the ordering, let me help you figure out how to do something productive with that side is key.
So, as you were talking, you have introduced a lot of new terms to me and also to the field. Can you name 10 of them?
Well, entropic modulation is the one I just named. And that's our most recent publication is on that. The publication before that, we introduced the term ethnobiommathematics, because ethnomathematics is well known, but typically when people are doing ethnomathematics, they're saying this is created by humans to help order nature or understand nature. Nature's chaos and humans bring order to it. And one of the things I've started to realize in the examples I was just giving you is that we really need a different field that talks about the intersection between mathematics and human agency and natural agency, right? It's really, it's not a dialectic between the two, it's a trialectic between the three in which these indigenous knowledge systems emerge. And that's why they're so good at things like sustainability and egalitarian relationships. So let's see, entropic modulation was one, and ethnobiommathematics is two. We've been using the term design agency a lot and heritage algorithms. And those aren't my terms, that's from Professor Audrey Bennett. The heritage algorithms concept, of course, is our version of ethnomathematics. So we'll say, yes, there's indigenous knowledge of things like geometry, but there's also indigenous knowledge of algorithms, right? And processes. And we need to be able to translate those between its indigenous form and the form you would use it to teach in the classroom. All of which falls under the category of ethnocomputing. I don't know what count I'm up to yet. Maybe that's 5. Okay. Generative justice is certainly an overarching umbrella for a lot of this, and that's the idea that contemporary economies use an extractive process, but we want a generative process that returns value in unalienated forms. I don't want to just have everything reduced to money, right? If I'm doing something like agriculture, I want to use organic agriculture, so I'm returning the waste materials into compost. And you can do the same with artificial materials, right? You can have that in a circular economy as well. You can do the same thing with labor value. So if I own my own business, that's, even if I'm not making much money at it, that's a radically a different form of labor than a factory floor where somebody's cracking the whip and telling me when I can take my bathroom break, right? So that language of generative justice, generative economy, I think all of that has a useful set of vocabularies to it. Let's see what else we've been talking about. The root and water metaphor, I think, is another good one. So when I first got into this, my engineering students would say, well, we're not like the old engineers that you're criticizing. We're the new generation. So we go into a community and ask them what problems they have. And then we tell them how we're going to solve those problems. And I said, yeah, that still sounds really one-sided to me. Communities aren't just a bundle of problems, right? They've got assets on their side. You've got assets on your side. Think about it like roots and water. So the roots are searching through the soil, the water is seeping through the soil, and eventually those are going to meet up in unpredictable ways. So that's the process you need to use these communities. Help them get all their assets and things out on the table. You folks bring in all the different assets and things you have on the table, and then see where the fruitful meetups can occur. So that's another domain in which we've been doing some of this work. Um, I think the very first book I ever wrote, African Fractals, um, just thinking about the idea that there might be this realm of fractal geometry that isn't quite universal. So when I talk to mathematicians, they always say, well, there's no such thing as cultural math, there's only math, right? There's just the one universal math. Um, I think trying to say, well, there are some ways in which math is drawing from the universal and some ways in which math is drawing from the local. And you can never quite bring an end to that, right? It's always going to be in that dialectic, that feedback. So just at the moment when you decide this is the one final universal world we've created called Euclidean mathematics, somebody says, yeah, but what if we just got rid of one of the axioms? So we'll say that sometimes two parallel lines do meet up, and that's when you're on a sphere and not on a plane. And I know right now it makes no sense to you Euclideans to think about spherical geometry, but let me just go with this and see where it leads, right? And so you end up with these non-Euclidean geometries being formed. And when you look at history, who are the actual folks doing this stuff? There's all kinds of interesting local motivations that are going into that. And of course, my favorite is fractals and the fact that Cantor was a bit of a mystic. He was a Rosicrucian, and he was looking at all that Egyptian art when he came up with transfinite set theory. And I suspect because when you look at the Egyptian art, it's drawing on those African, recursive iterative forms that go off to infinity. So I think I don't know if African fractals. I guess that's an example of what I'm talking about in a more general way of speaking. Eleanor, why don't you come up with the term for this? So it's that way in which the universal and the local come together.
So I think before you were talking about, I think you did generative justice. So then you're talking about generative AI. So the artists posting their work so that they
Yeah,
can
yeah, yeah,
receive.
yeah. So you want generative mathematics?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then also, I
So
think
so Nicole, make a note that number 10 was actually from Eleanor, not from me.
Will do. Good job, Ron.
that is
you,
just a
you
list,
passed the
but
quiz.
from you did amazing. Um, I guess our last question will be, where do you see your work in 5 years or in the future? Where do you want to take your work?
Retirement.
We'll add
So
that to the
so
list.
so my wife has a plan for me called work until you die. And I keep telling her that's not the one that I want. I want the retirement plan. Yeah, I think when you go into these labor analyses and labor disciplines, it's really easy to focus on things like folks not getting ripped off and getting paid the right amount and not having bad labor conditions, having good labor conditions and so on. But the other side of that is enjoying not working, right? And Karl Marx, folks don't often don't realize his son-in-law was black. He was from the Caribbean, and he wrote a wonderful book called "The Right to Be Lazy." And Marx absolutely hated the book, and said it was anathema to everything he was doing. But I think he was really on something. Paul Dumas, I believe is his name. I think Dumas was really onto something there, that we're not taking laziness into account in the way that we're framing human activity. There's my future.
That sounds like a good future. Um, yeah, I think retirement is a great it's great. I think you can do a lot with it. What
My plan is to do nothing with it. That's the lazy part.
Yeah, that's so true. I guess we can ask a couple more questions just because we have you and you're so engaging. Um, I, Nicole, do you have any questions? I feel like I'm still trying to let everything sink in. Um, yeah.
So this didn't count in the 10 terms, but you used unalienated labor, which seems so important right now, just in terms of our economy, the push for a different political economic system that's trying to grow in the 2024 presidential elections as like a main topic. Can you say a little bit more about how that's influencing this work and why it at all is showing up in STEM research?
Yeah, so there's two meanings of the word alienated. Um, the psychological meaning, we always think of the teenager who paints her room black and screams, "I hate you, mom." And she says, "I feel alienated from my family and society," and listens to death metal music. So that's the psychological form of alienation, right? Um, but when Karl Marx was saying the alienation of labor value, he meant it the way the U.S. Constitution says these unalienable rights. That which cannot be alienated from you are your rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So when you're working in unalienated labor, you're immersed in things that enrich the human spirit, right? And so you have a sense of pride in your work, and it that doesn't have to be a big ego. You can just say, I did a good job in this, and what drove me to do this work wasn't the amount of money I was getting paid or the foreman cracking the whip. It was the fact that I just love doing something that looks and feels great, you know. Um, so that's that sense of unalienated labor that Marx was trying to get at. And he had been reading Hegel and this very sort of mystical, spiritual ideals that Hegel was putting out. But he tried to translate that into something that was very practical. So I think one of the things that's attractive about Marx was that he sort of had a foot in both of those worlds, right? Um, but the downside of Marx is that he eventually gave up on that, and very early on you can see him saying, well, the only practical way to do this is not to turn over the workplace to the workers, it's to turn over the workplace to the state and to have everything centralized. And so we'll have all the factories will be owned by the state, and that way we can make sure that the workers are treated well. So it was a very paternalistic output. You peasants are like children, you don't know how to do things. We'll come in, the vanguard will come in and do things for you. um, so that was the downfall of that theoretical framework. This idea that it's okay to extract value as long as the value is going to the state, and the state is run by the communists. So the shift that we were trying to introduce was to say there's something about unalienated value that's just precious and that needs to be protected from alienation. We shouldn't be striving to make the most hyper efficient, the fastest and the biggest and the strongest. And this is always the Soviet Union thing, right? We're now going to have the world's largest iron smelting plant to prove the might of communism. It's much better to bring a sense of humility to things and say, yeah, this probably isn't the most efficient way. But people love being in charge of their own work and taking the breaks whenever they damn well please, because laziness needs to be a part of life, just like working hard needs to be a part of life. And I don't want an economic system that tries to beat that out of me, right? I want to feel that I'm in this unalienated, emancipated space. So yeah, we've been trying to use that in ways that are both subtle but very specific as well. And so worker-owned work or worker collectives, I think, has been a key economic feature that we've been trying to investigate. But you can think about those principles in a classroom as well, right? So you can think about at what point does the student take great pride in something, and how does that motivate them, right, to do the kinds of work that's going to make them great students. It's not necessarily going to be cracking the whip and disciplining them. It's going to be setting things up so that the directions they're moving in is the direction of learning and the direction of increased academic skills. And you can take a very paternalistic approach to it, or you can say, I need to think about how to set up the conditions in which they're able to do that on their own.
There's I mean, you talked before about African fractals and fractal geometry, and in our earlier conversations, you made a comment that, you know, there's a reason why fractal geometry is not prevalent in the United States. You know, we have education boards, we have curriculum standards, we have those tests that you mentioned, that at the end of the day, the teachers have to prepare for. But those exist in a larger system, and that system within a larger political economic context, the one that you were just describing about in terms of, you know, the proliferation in this country of alienated labor and the direction of that expanding versus retracting. In terms of those systems and those decision makers, what would have to happen for us to really lean deeper or deeply into Indigenous knowledge so that fractal geometry is everywhere, and the fractal geometries of the world are don't disappear, that they're known, that they're experienced, and we can see from your website, fractal geometry really is everywhere. It's on our head, it's in our clothing, it's in our fabrics, it's, you know, in the living room. But this is a way of knowing that has not been prioritized by those who set the standards for a curriculum, and who teach our educators what they will be teaching the next generations. Can you speak to some of your experiences with those systems, and then also what would it take to really mainstream this knowledge, or allow it to flourish within education systems, even if it's a locale or if in one state?
Yeah, I think the cornrows simulations are a great example of that, right? So when we first presented those at the NCTM, we got huge crowds of African American math teachers in the room, and the ethnomath group that I was working with said they were just floored at the turnout. And previously, you know, they'd been holding these little NCTM sessions that were just very poorly attended. And I said, yeah, well, you know, if you're saying how to count to 10 in Yoruba, that's just going to have very limited appeal, right? And so teachers are, when they do make an effort to bring in indigenous mathematics, it's strained through a filter, and the filter is exactly as you said. It's what's being, you know, imposed from above and sort of regulated as the proper way to indoctrinate students in the discipline of mathematics. And so you need to, you know, flip that around. Start with the math that you're finding that's not filtered out. So if I go into a braiding shop and I ask math teachers, you know, help me out with some math here, they'll immediately come up with word problems. They'll say, okay, so we're going to make a word problem on how many braids are on this scalp given the surface area of the scalp or something. For some students that's helpful. And certainly saying that mathematics exists in places other than your math textbook and other than, I don't know where they would take them in the neighborhood to show them math. But just giving them a feel that you can go other places and find math locally is good. But it's still such a very limited window on the mathematical world, right? And so if you shift your perspective and you look at this spectacular cornrow braiding pattern that's on somebody's head, and you say, I don't want math as in count the number of braids, because the braider probably didn't even do that, right? You're just imposing math on it. I want to go in the other direction. What's the math that's emerging, in this pattern making activity? So the computational medium is really spectacular for doing that. And I think we tend to undersell it and use the computational medium for essentially making animated word problems. And I understand why, because it's a great fit to the curriculum, but it's neither doing justice to the indigenous material nor to computation itself as a link to mathematical ways of knowing, to use it in that fashion. So just watching the kids use those cornrow pattern generating scripts has been a real eye-opener for me in trying to figure out, how do we go about helping them get at the sort of indigenous side of this, the local thinking that's going on in the heads and hands and hearts of the braiders. And so sometimes we'll introduce a term like the curliness, right? We'll say, well, this is a very loose spiral, and this is a tightly curled spiral. And so you get the kids, using that distinction, but that's not in the textbook anywhere. And so then we'll say, okay, well, now let's come up with the math part of this. What did you change in that script in order to get it more tightly curled? And it turns out there's more than one parameter you can change, right? So for a math teacher, that's very uncomfortable, because you wanted to have, this equation for this named parameter, rather than saying, well, there's these three parameters and you can manipulate those in different ways and create these different effects. But that's much more representative of what the students are going to encounter if they actually got hired as, a graphic designer using computational arts, right? Or even when you go into something like Photoshop, and you're just trying to do a transform. And so you're saying, yeah, reflect over the x-axis, reflect over the y-axis. Even then, you're using math in just more creatively interesting ways than you're typically provided opportunities for in the classroom. So I think, to me, that computational medium is really magical. But I don't want to create barriers for teachers, right? And so some of them have said, look, I'm not trained in programming and I'm not comfortable in it. So one of the things you'll notice on the cornrow site is we introduced a different interface that's strictly math. And so you're just putting in the parameters, right? So here's how many iterations of plaits make up a braid. Here's how much you rotate each plait by, and you're just entering in the numbers. And the a group that does that national computer science training, Jane Margolis at UCLA has been the head of that. So they've been giving us some feedback of the teachers, and they said, yeah, it's funny, we can start math teachers with the math interface as a way to then introduce the programming interface. But when we do follow-ups and ask them what they use, they always go back to the math interface. So they don't want to get involved with the programming. And that's part of the local agency of the teachers, right? So it's not just nurturing the agency of the students. I think nurturing the agency of the teachers also has to be a part of how we're thinking about this.
So the braiding and the cornrow example reminded me of one of your papers when you were talking about rice terracing in Bali and how maybe the farmers aren't thinking about it in like a math perspective or in a computing perspective, but are using a lot of strategies that end up reducing pesticides and reducing inputs that they need for farming. And I would love to just switch gears a little bit and talk more about how climate change intersects in your work. You know, I'm going to Indonesia soon, so just like talking about that too, and how I can, you know, just pinpoint everything that you're talking about.
Indonesia has such a spectacular, amazing array of resources and artifacts and phenomena, right? Everything from the rice irrigation system on Bali to these woven baskets. There's a tradition in Indonesia of making baskets as pentagons that has a really beautiful mathematical weaving pattern. I've never gotten a chance to do a simulation on it, but I'm dying to. If you can send me some pictures of that, if you come across any, I'd love to see that. I think, you know, thinking about the rice irrigation example. So they're not using, of course, mathematical terminology for it, but they are describing with terminology, and often you'll see a spiritual terminology being used in places where I might bring in terminology from systems science or systems engineering or self-organization theory. So one of the reasons why we called that project Ubuntu AI is that Ubuntu means I am because we are, right? And so it's that concept of collectivity. I would use terminology like self-organization, but the terminology of Ubuntu works perfectly well, and folks understand that I mean some kind of bottom-up collectivity when I'm using that term. So of course, all these things are threatened by climate, right? What grasses are going to be left for making baskets out of once climate devastation comes in? And so thinking about these ecological connections, but the reverse of it is thinking about these things as solutions to providing climate resilience. We just got a new grant for our Detroit project. That started as a grant from the NSF Future Work Program called Automation for the Artisanal Economy. So we're working with worker-owned businesses, collectives in Detroit.
I think you just.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've got this NSF project out in Detroit, working with worker-owned businesses, small businesses, and worker collectives. And a lot of the folks we interviewed in the urban farming area said that they lack electrical power. And so all the wonderful things we were proposing around, you know, digital soil sensors and water sensors and electric pumps and timers and things, they couldn't use because they didn't have electricity out on the urban farms. They also had a problem with water. And so if you're using rainfall and you've got climate change coming in, that's going to destroy your crops. So we worked with Keep Growing Detroit, which is a local group that installs rain catchment systems, and Family First Solar, which is a Black-owned worker collective that installs solar photovoltaics. And we got a small grant that is now funding a combination of water harvesting and solar photovoltaics to create these powered irrigation systems on these little urban farms around Detroit. And then once we have those established, now we can bring in the NSF digital computational projects. Now, the great thing about this is that by bringing in solar photovoltaics, you're reducing the carbon footprint, right? By bringing in rainwater catchment, you're reducing the flooding threats. So one of the big problems with climate change is that cities were not built for these giant, you know, huge rainfalls. And so you get flooding in Detroit. And of course, our artisans don't have expensive high rises. They're, you know, located down in the basement somewhere. So a recent study was done on dealing with flooding in Detroit, and they said that the urban farms in general are actually helping absorb a lot of the rainfall and not sending it to the sewers, which get overwhelmed during flooding. But all the push to say, oh well, that's inefficient. We can't have a bunch of scattered little urban farms. We have to have one big giant farm, because then you can afford a tractor and bring in these economies of scale. That's terrible for climate resilience. What actually enhances climate resilience is having all those little tiny scattered, quote unquote, inefficient urban farms. So we've just submitted a grant to the NSF for looking at this idea of bringing in some of those indigenous traditions of small scale decentralized operations, whether that's in the urban farming realm or the business realm, or even thinking about it online, and bringing those principles of entropic modulation, of sort of going back and forth between something that's very decentralized and diverse, and then bringing in some kind of ordered sensibility to it. So one of the things we've been looking at on the ordered side is, if you want to get all those little urban farms to have pickup and delivery, you need a delivery system. And they could do something like Uber Eats, but that means that a big chunk of their pay is not going to them. It's going to Uber Eats, right? So I've asked my grad students in the School of Information to start working on a server-side application that will be owned and run by the farmers and the deliverers. So instead of the unalienated experience of being an Uber driver and having it say, oh, you're gonna, you took a break and so you've lost your pay, or whatever heinous mechanisms they have, it's going to be the reverse. The Uber drivers get to say, well, I can do this, this, and this. I need to pick up my kids at this time, and I get tired easily, and so I want to break around this time. And now the algorithm will actually be trying to integrate that into the pickup and delivery system, as opposed to punishing you for it or filtering it out or something. So there's really interesting ways of using these advanced computational technologies to think about climate resilience from the very physical end of how do we reduce the carbon footprint, and how do we build in resilience for things like flooding that's caused by climate catastrophes. But also on the business side of how do you make that sustainable, so that the things are funding themselves and you don't have to keep having these influxes of cash coming in.
Amazing. So I think we're going to wrap up now. Last question, I promise. Where can we learn more about your work?
CSDT.org, great place to learn about it.
Great. And
the generative justice website, generative justice, all one word, .org. And that has more of the economic side of things.
Okay. And we'll have all of that linked below. And yeah, thank you so much for talking with us. Milwaukee Evaluation is very grateful. Yeah, everything will be linked below. And thank you again.
It's been a pleasure.